I want to kind of start because when I read the book, all right, and a disagreement here, but I would like to at least begin to get at what I saw as Jesus the Christ presented as a white supremacist. Okay, I went back to look, right, and I looked all day, and I got caught up on the last couple of chapters because of that we want to look at how next steps. How can we move? But the closest that I could come is when you say every attempt was made by white clergy and theologians to equate white supremacy with the will of God. This was the case either in shameless intentionality, God as white supremacist, or ultimate benevolence, God as sovereign Lord. The selling point, of course, was that the white race's possession of social, economic, and political power meant that God had intentionally ordained that placement, and that placement being, how about not just slave, but the dehumanization. All right, because when we get past slavery, we still see black folk being dehumanized, right? So the dehumanization of black folk, and that God had ordained that by virtue of God's own whiteness. So you present to me. Now, you didn't use those words. I kind of said that you used those exact words, and we went, talked about that. But in either case, there is that sense that there was from someplace, somewhere, a message relating that was being related to people about who God was and God's intentions. And what I just read is that message was wrapped up in the fact of somehow God was made white. Therefore, Jesus, the Christ, right? Father, Son, Jesus, and not just white, but white supremacist, right? And that he ordained the state in which black folk through the years. And we can even go back to pre-colonial periods, right?
Yes.
Or ordained to be dehumanized, to be mistreated, to be beat, to be worked to death and not paid, right?
For their salvation.
For their salvation. Can we sort of start there? It was interesting because I was reading, and it makes you think. When I picked up the second book by another author and saw some of the same things being said, it's like, okay, let's really think about this. But can we start there in terms of Jesus, and you correct me, but Jesus as white supremacist?
Well, as you did note just now, I draw on two presentations of Jesus by white Christian leadership to not only their people, but especially slaves. That is, as Jesus as a vowed white supremacist and Jesus as sovereign Lord. Those are two typologies of how Jesus had been presented, particularly as we move into the mid-18th and up into the 19th century. We start seeing the proliferation of white images of Jesus. Now, the reason for this is always twofold, and it's no different here. Christianity is the only religion that maintains that God came to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that God was incarnate. That's what makes us, proud to be Christian.
Right.
This distinction, maybe too much, sometimes to a fault. As we move to Christian superiority theories as well. But the intention with white Christian leaders was simple. If we can make Jesus white, then in our attempt to sell black people on their inferiority, that if we by imaging Jesus white, we are also saying that God's incarnation in Jesus was to incarnate God's self as a white man. This served two purposes. Number one, of course, to legitimate whiteness, skin color, as a superior manifestation of being human, and to establish darker skin as an inferior way of being human. In doing so, it would enable whites to better socially control slaves by then selling them on the fact that this superior relationship between the races is the linchpin that should legitimate in the slave mind the authenticity of slavery itself, not just as a historical institution, but as a divine institution. And so in this sense, in the first typology, God as a vowed white supremacist held by many white Christian leaders was that God ordained racial superiority of whiteness and the racial inferiority of blackness. And that in light of that, God ordained whites to make the major decisions on the social, economic, and political dispensation of justice in the life of not only the nation, but the world, but particularly the nation. And so if Jesus was white, and if God became Jesus, and Jesus said, when you see me, you see the Father, then it must necessarily by inference mean that God is white as well. So if you are black, and you are in a state of bondage, and you're being sold that God is white, then it makes logical racist sense, as I call it, for you to more thoroughly internalize your inferiority because you're not white. So rather than looking at the Christian theological spectrum through the lens of one common humanity, the theological breach is made when white Christian ministers and theologians and slaveholders decided to make a distinction between quality of humanity in God's eyes based on skin pigmentation, which of course is the meaning of racism. And so in that sense, God is made an avowed white supremacist in the sense that God identifies with and condones the goals of white men on earth in their attempt to build an economic empire for themselves, or particularly to build it on the free slave labor in the backs of non-white people, namely black slaves from Africa. The other typology, God as sovereign Lord, does not list God as a white supremacist. And this was the other approach that some white Christian leaders took. That was that Jesus is white, and God also by inference is white, but there is no condoning of slavery in this typology. That in this particular typology, God is unconcerned about human suffering. Now, this is a very important point and probably has been just as virulent post-slavery than God as a avowed white supremacist. Because then it creates a theological dilemma on the part of slaves that if we have been enslaved for this long, then maybe God does not care about our suffering. At the same time, the theological rebuke, once again, is that biblical revelation shows us that God is concerned about human relationships and human history. In fact, the incarnation itself is a manifestation that God is concerned not only about the human plight, but he's concerned about the plight of people who are exploited, who are marginalized, and who don't have the power to fight like they should to affirm their humanity. That is also running consistent through biblical revelation. So it was very important for white Christian leaders to establish that we are dealing with a God, even of Jesus Christ, even of biblical revelation, that is either a condoner of white supremacy or is someone who is unconcerned about what's happening to black people on earth as an enslaved people. Both of them are profound theological breaches of understanding biblical revelation to me, but yet at the same time became two selling points for understanding not only the reality of God and divine will, but the meaning of the incarnation itself.
Okay. And was there not more to that? And I'd say more to it because that was also some, I'm going to use the word brainwashing, right? That had to be done to white folk, right? As you look at those two sides, what was important as I read some of your book and I apologize, but I think some of that the historical pieces from Kendi, as I read from even as we look at pre-colonial coming into the Americas, economic situations, right? That was how we're going to get money, and at the same time have not cheap labor but free labor. But that there were also those white folks who didn't believe in it, but at the same time they didn't want to lose their free labor. Is that right? So they also had to be convinced of the supremacy of their own whiteness.
Right.
And I think that was
important as the conditioning of slave minds as well. Just as important. If, in some cases, some would argue more important.